Hello, everyone. Welcome to Friday. I'm sure you can feel the end of the semester pulling at you, deadlines flying, seemingly faster than anyone could expect, and probably right at this moment, you're just starting to be tempted by the glorious weather outside. I hope, at least, wherever you find yourself, that your day is as nice as the one I've had here in Ottawa. It's beautiful, and so you have my sincere sympathies if right now you're just being pulled to the outside world, wishing perhaps that you had an audiobook version of this text that you could listen to while walking outside. Take heart. There's not much left, and soon summer will be upon us all. Or at least the kind of spring that doesn't involve the fresh discoveries of all of your neighbor's dogs' droppings on your front walk. That's the one thing I'm having to deal with here negatively. Today's going to be a chance just to offer a few comments on things that might have maybe not surprised you, but caught you off guard, or questions, at least in the texts, that I suspect you may have had. And in going through this, I'm at the very end, I'm also going to discuss a few pointers for those of you that are working through the final paper right now. So you'll want to pay attention for those, but also I hope you'll pay attention for everything. To start with, I want to talk about a few of the points in each of the pieces that at least might have been head scratchers, especially if you're coming to this class, or if you came here with less of a familiarity with some parts of the Western, let's say, history, what we would call the canon, those foundational texts or ideas, narratives that shaped and inform the writings of each of these authors, and in ways that we might not be aware of, or that some of us who have not encountered these ideas before might not realize have an importance. And to start, I want to talk about Augustine and the way he talks about suicide, because there are some he interacts with Plato and speaks about the suicide of Theombrotus, and the way in which perhaps individuals who committed suicide in the past, famous examples of people who had killed themselves. Actually, one note on this: I am currently attempting as best I can to remove certain types of nomenclature from my speaking, in doing some background readings and talking to some mental health professionals. So I wouldn't say it's quite a Lenten practice, but it's something that happens to be changing in my life during Lent. And that is attempting as much as possible to refuse to use the language of committing suicide. The reason for that is because one commits a crime, whereas other things are generally done. I don't commit breakfast. I don't commit sleep. I might commit theft, or obviously one would commit murder. And committing suicide is a type of language that gets used for a very specific purpose. And that is to associate a type of criminal activity with the event. Now, this becomes especially strange or anachronistic when we note, even in Gill, he notes that suicide was itself a criminal activity until 1961. And in the majority of countries in the West, suicide is now actually not a crime. Now, why does this matter? Since obviously it's not a victimless crime, but it was one that would not be prosecutable. Obviously, or perhaps not obviously, and therefore requiring this explanation, one of the main reasons why it was decriminalized was because the there was a certain type of indemnity associated with criminal acts. So if you had a life insurance policy, or perhaps you had a pension that was eventually due to your next of kin upon your death, if you committed some type of a crime, perhaps there's a morality clause in your pension. Committing suicide was deemed to be grounds for revoking the privileges which accrued to your next of kin or your designated beneficiaries in some life insurance policies or even in wills. So when we say instead that someone dies by suicide, we are acknowledging that there was an act of self-inflicted harm that went so far as to lead to death. However, there's a type of destigmatization that I think is inherent in saying die by suicide that I believe is important. This is not to say that I'm trying to settle some sort of debate and say that suicide is not sinful, because it still very clearly breaks the commandment to not kill. And so there are parts of Augustine's discussion that still remain valid in the way that it is described as a sin. However, there are a number of different factors which enter into any discussion of suicide that I don't think benefit from the criminalization of the activity. It certainly leads to an unwillingness to engage with what is referred to as parasuicides in the text. So these attempts at suicide. So the attempt on one's own life, which is actually something done to cry for help, is something that becomes less sympathetic, and we are perhaps less likely to engage with individuals who are criminals or have been deemed to have performed a criminal act than if we speak of someone who is in a period of great mental or economic distress. Sometimes even their health suffers such that they seek to end their own lives as a form of unsanctioned euthanasia. Whatever it might be, there's a very real way in which I think speaking about suicide as an act rather than a crime is an important qualification that we, who are people, for every one of you who is now becoming someone well versed in ethical concepts, this type of language coming from people such as yourself is a very crucial way of normalizing that type of language. You are all becoming experts, or at least competent. I hope that through your own study and self-reflection, you get to the point where you can actually say, I feel as though I'm an expert. I have some degree of expertise. But at bare minimum, let's start with competency and work towards expertise. And in doing so, you'll become the people, whether this is in your parishes or serving congregations or other sort of parachurch organizations, in your work life, wherever it might be. If you've told anyone that you're taking this kind of course, you might be the kind of person that your colleagues, coworkers, or parishioners ask these questions of. And so the type of language that you use is important. So I simply encourage you to attempt to also inculcate within you this practice of saying that people who kill themselves die by suicide rather than commit suicide. Now, that said, there's a bit of a strange passage that is the one I think we should be unpacking in Augustine. When he talks in section 13.11, he talks about Theombrotus, and he says that there's this question of whether or not killing himself shows greatness of soul. So Plato says this about the death of Theombrotus. It shows greatness of soul rather than goodness. What's behind those two words can be lost in English, and I think the reason why requires a bit of further explanation. I'm sure all of you have that one pedantic friend, or maybe sometimes you are the pedantic friend, and bless your heart, it's so great to have people like you in our lives to remind us of the importance of the English language. So someone says to you, "Oh, how you doing?" And you say, "I'm good." And then this friend, or perhaps you, says, "Well, actually, don't you mean you're doing well?" The idea that I should say that I am doing well rather than doing good, because, I mean, if I'm doing good, doing good means something like, "I'm helping to cure cancer today," or "I just fed lunch to a bunch of orphans." So this idea that good is in fact a moral qualifier is what people are getting at. So how are you doing? You're doing well. Now, the other issue with that language is that a moral qualifier like good refers to an action or to a thing. But how are you doing is not a statement inquiring after your actions, but rather you as a person. So, when you or I have to do our lives, are we doing our lives well? Are you doing, this is usually a lot more than you get into when someone walks by and say, "Hi, how you doing?" They're hoping for the pat answer most of the time. But that little play on words is a great linguistic window to get into this difference that Plato brings up in between goodness and greatness. See, greatness for the Greek Plato and for those who wrote the New Testament, greatness was quite simply megas, the same word that we get the prefix mega from. So you want to build a mega project. You're a megalomaniac. You bought a lotto ticket for mega millions. Greatness simply means really, really big. It's generally seen as a prefix to describe size of something. This isn't necessarily length, this isn't necessarily volume, but just something that's big. So it's a qualifier that indicates size. And when someone is said to be of great spirit, obviously, or in this case, that they demonstrated great spirit in killing themselves, the Imbrotus, this is different from doing something that is good. Because it's very obvious to imagine how we can do good actions that are themselves quite small. They may be insignificant in their causal relationship to the world. When I reach down to pet a stray cat, that might be a good moment of tender kindness to an animal that does not encounter such kindnesses very often. So that's a good thing to do. But it's certainly not a great thing. It doesn't possess the significance of curing cancer or building a house for someone. Whatever it might be, this should be intuitive to be able to pick out an action that is great or an action that is good. And when we say this about a human spirit, that things can be either great or good, we should also be getting a sense of what is appropriate for a person. Obviously, the person who we associate with that megas the most would be Alexander the Great. We have also sort of Basil the Great, an early church father. Gregory the Great, who was a pope. These figures are the big ones that have that name. So that qualifier exists. The Great Wall of China rather than the Minor Wall of China. This gets to a vision of sort of what a person should be or generally is, and then what a person can be. So greatness is not something to which we default. Obviously, that's not the case, because if we were all by default great, then none of us would be great. So you need to have some type of gradation, some hierarchical arrangement. Maybe not being hierarchy. Let's say layers. I was going to say like stratigraphy, but stratified is what I'm going for. That in the order of human life, there are perhaps people who live it at different levels, people whose ambition drives them to achieve greatness. This greatness is discussed or is referred to by Plato in a way that is not necessarily good. So when Plato says that Theombrotus does a great thing by killing himself, it can in fact not only be something that is not good, but it can be something that's bad, because in a way that's reminiscent of the personalist virtue ethics that we've discussed, Greeks, including Plato, had a very clear appreciation of the limits of human finitude. And so greatness was perhaps something that was chased by significant figures in antiquity, but it was always pursued with the background understanding, at least in Greek cultures, that there is a limit to what humans can achieve. And so our cliche that man's reach is always beyond his grasp was exactly the sort of danger that Greeks identified in their construction of virtues that sought a middle path. So paradigmatically, the myth of the wings of our poor little friend Icarus. Icarus, he who with his father fashioned wings made of wax that allowed him to fly, and yet he flew too close to the sun, and the wax wings melted, and he plummeted into the ocean and died. This attempt to strive too far, to desire too much greatness, was a cautionary tale. Now, it's worth remembering that the story of Icarus also includes prohibitions against not caring too much, because with the wings, if you fly too high, they melt, but if you fly too low, they catch the water and you tumble and you fall into the ocean regardless. So there's a very clear example of that virtuous mean down the middle, not too high, not too low. But what concerns us right now is the idea of greatness, and that suicide could perhaps be an act that is great, but not good. And this Greek, or in fact Greco-Roman concept, when it's transposed into a Christian mindset, such as that demonstrated by Augustine, is in fact shown to be a double negative. So what we have is something that is neither great nor good. But that requires almost a different type of moral outlook, because for the Greeks, greatness, when it's not appropriate to given individuals, maybe there's a particular person, let's say like Alexander, who was marked for greatness and was given through fortune a certain privilege of power, and he could do this in a way that did not invite divine wrath. So there was no nemesis sent by the gods to smite Alexander for his overweening pride, because it fell to him to actually be great. But for the majority of people, greatness was something that, for them at least, was supposed to be much smaller. But for Augustine, the greatness of he who committed suicide, of Theombrotus, is never even on the table, because to be great in the Christian perspective is actually to humble oneself. There's a way in which the first become last and the last become first in our version of the virtues. So striving for greatness and excellence is actually a type of self-abnegation. We use the language of kenosis in this case, where he who is the Christ becomes great through emptying himself of all of his divine authority and submitting to death, even death on a cross. Then he is raised up. But it is only through that self-denial, the making oneself less, that the exaltation eventually comes. An exaltation which is eschatological in shape. So Augustine doesn't have any truck with either the greatness or the goodness, because the greatness being displayed is actually one which is contrary to any type of Christian version of the good life. So I hope that makes a little sense of what that little hiccup is, because great and goodness can be different. And I hope also that the next time somebody asks you how you're doing, I hope you just realize, like, it's fine to say that you're doing good. Because I'm not a pedant, and also because you should hopefully, as someone who's trying to live a theological life, a philosophical life, we're engaged in a type of academic study that, in order to function properly, needs to also be personally appropriated. There's a way in which you can wake up in the morning and, let's say you're a physical therapist, and so as a physical therapist, you get up and you do physical therapy from 9 to 5, and you go home and you're just you. For theology, and in a different but related way, and in a way that probably should be more homogeneous, being a theologian or being a philosopher doesn't just stop and start in between 9 to 5. It doesn't just start when you turn on this video or when you open your textbook. There's a real way in which the life of those engaged in theological pursuits should also be internalizing and expressing the subject matter being examined. So when someone asks you if you're doing, and you say you're doing good, I hope that is true. Not because you're curing cancer or not curing cancer, but because in everything that you do, you ought to be at least striving to do the good. So, with that said, that's just one part of Augustine. To offer a bit of commentary on the text from Aquinas and his assessment of sexual relationships in between men and women, I don't want to treat it as lightly as I did perhaps in the last lecture. There should be a real way in which we are able to discuss at least the text in a way that takes seriously the ideas of the author, even if we might hear or read any significant analysis of just where semen lands and its relation to the functional ends of a human being, with a bit of a laugh on our face. There's some smirking that goes into this, but once we move past the childish response to Aquinas's way of considering the human person and human bodily fluids, I want to just say a bit more about why Aquinas conceives of a human person in this way, with reference to a particular line. So this is in his section 1426. Aquinas says that bodily organs are the instruments of the soul. And that is a very clear demonstration of the indebtedness that Aquinas had to his encounter with Aristotle. Now, Aquinas comments on who he calls the philosopher in sort of a roundabout way. Aristotelian texts come to Aquinas and others during the 12th century or 13th century via Islamic sources. So Ibn Sina, Averroes are Islamic scholars who themselves offered commentaries on Aquinas or on Aristotle, and via their work, these texts get translated. So from Greek to Arabic, and then from Arabic to Latin, and then in Latin, we have Aquinas who reads these texts and is profoundly influenced by them. In between the period of sort of the early church up until Aquinas, the dominant Greek philosopher who influences Christian theology, which is essentially Christian philosophy, is Plato. So from Plato, we end up getting versions of Stoicism who Stoicism is a type of Neoplatonism, so it's a later appropriation of Platonic philosophy. And we find influences of Stoicism even in Paul's writings later on via Manichae, who was a Persian follower of Plato. So again, in a Neoplatonic strand who appropriates some of Plato's ideas, we get the Manichaeism that then is the religion of Augustine before his conversion to Christianity. So the ways in which, not just sort of for Christianity, but against, when Augustine is writing contra Celsus, so the pagan philosopher Celsus or Celsus, he himself was deeply influenced by Platonism. And the switch that happens, specifically in the writings of Aquinas, is a turning point where the role of Aristotle as the sort of the dialogue partner of Christian philosophers changes. And this happens at a moment in time also when universities, the first universities are really coming into their own, Paris, Oxford. I want to say the Italian one is in Milan, but I feel like that's wrong. Someone can correct me in the comments. But sort of the initial Bologna, there we go. These earliest universities emerge as separate knowledge centers, separate from canon schools or monasteries, and offer a way of pursuing academic endeavors in faculties rather than in unified ways. So you don't have these Renaissance men who were themselves attempting to ape a type of classical model where single individuals just knew everything. If you were a scholar, if you knew something, you actually knew everything. So the study from rhetoric and grammar to history, theology, natural philosophy, these things all go together and slowly accrete through a person's lifetime. Universities offer a different way of doing this, and so individual faculties within a university replicate particular functions or particular domains that had formerly all been united in one scholar's mind. And around the time of Aquinas, you have these universities that have departments or faculties of theology as well as faculties of philosophy. So right as these faculties of philosophy are coming into existence, they are also given a new data set. They are given the work of Aristotle. And in this particular line, so that bodily organs are the instruments of the soul, there's a clear relationship to the Aristotelian concept of hylomorphism. Now, that's an odd word that your spell check might not even be able to recognize as a real word. It's out there. My list of exceptions in my spell check after a decade of academic study it's probably a book in of itself. So my apologies if you have to keep saying, you're writing a final paper, say, no, that's a word, and it keeps trying to correct you. I wish it gets better, but it doesn't. You just need to develop your own vocabulary and your own word set. But hylomorphism refers to the Aristotelian understanding of the relationship in between the soul and the body. So there is in the vision of Plato this idea that may be familiar to some of you of form and matter. So there's the realm of forms, or the realm of ideas, and the realm of matter, the realm of appearances. And so in grade 9 history, you probably at some point had some clever teacher be like, well, Plato's idea for a chair or a table, is this the ideal table? And all other tables participate in tableness. So a table has to have 4 legs, but they can be this big or that big. And every finite example of a table is itself merely a representation or a figment. It participates in the idea of the Platonic ideal of a table. This is the 9th grade version. However, hylomorphism, which we associate with Aristotle, was actually a rejection of his teacher's concept of the world of forms and the world of matter, because for Aristotle, there really was just one world. And so the soul is, so for Aristotle, the soul is the form of the body. By form, we can mean or refer to the organizing principle. But this way of speaking about things hylomorphically is a way to connect the soul or the spirit of a thing and the actual representation of that thing. So it's not that I have a soul separate from my body in a dualistic sense, or that there is some all soul from which my particular finite instance sort of descends and joins with this. Rather, that I metaphysically have a form which organizes and shapes my body. So, with that in mind, read that line again. Bodily organs are instruments of the soul. The human soul for Aquinas is that organizing principle. It is something that our attempts to use language like immaterial or supernatural are difficult to associate in a strong correlation, because those types of distinctions, supernatural, natural, even material, immaterial, are foreign to the way of thinking of the medievals. And so this resists a type of contemporary facile reasoning away. It's like, oh, so what you're saying is this is merely DNA. That's not the case, because the soul is immaterial, but more properly you would say that it is invisible. We cannot apprehend it through our sense faculties. We need to rely on our reason to be able to talk about this. And it's important to say these things because all of Aquinas' vision of sexual relations presume that the form that gives shape to our bodies is this ultimate organizing principle. So obviously, if penises and uteruses are themselves forms, or they are parts of the body, these organs are themselves doing the work of the soul which forms them, then it makes sense to then speak of all of our bodily apparatus as being tools used to carry out the purpose and function of the human being. So our organizing principle, the soul which determines how we function, builds for itself or organizes matter for itself in a way that enables it to then carry out its task, which is to live a life in relationship to God, and to be able to carry on the existence of the flourishing of the human species along the way. Seen in that light, it begins to make much more sense why it matters where we stick it when the lights go off. Because any and every activity of the human body is only made possible by the use of organs which are themselves representations of they're the toolkit that the soul uses to do its work, which is ultimately to praise God and be in relationship with God. So in light of that, take Aquinas' argument perhaps a little bit more seriously. So with that said, perhaps you've been convinced by the validity of this functional account of the human person, and you think that Aquinas' appropriation of an Aristotelian version of humans having a purpose or a functional goal towards which they need to work then makes total sense. And so since we are in fact created in order to praise or be in relationship with God, all of these other things along the way make sense. The place where this falls apart after that initial enthusiasm at the reception is that there exist a number of exceptions that occur naturally. And so if if we take seriously the idea that sex is ultimately a procreative act, and so sex, once it is engaged in between a married husband or a married man and a woman, and nobody tries to pull out at the wrong time, and everybody puts everything where they're supposed to, then sex is not sinful. There is still a whole bunch of exceptions which seem to create numerous problems for this point of view, because, again, this is a very strongly deontological model. This is a universal claim upon human sexuality, a universal claim on the purpose and function of human beings. And as Gill goes on to note, there are a number of problems which are presented to natural law theorists, such as the supposedly natural way in which sometimes embryos fail to implant in the wall of the uterus. And if we are to assume that the natural way of things is that which is good, to simply sort of point out one argument that is frequently appealed to in debates surrounding at least the focus on women's health and abortion issues, these spontaneously aborted embryos ought to be accorded the same moral significance as humans, as any human child, because this embryo is, or this zygote at that point, simply a fertilized egg, has within it the same life, the same significance, because by virtue of its ensoulment at the point of conception, as the aborted fetus, as the miscarriage, as the baby carried to term. And so, and as also any one of those fertilized eggs which exists in a process of sort of artificial like IVF, so where you do in vitro fertilization, or forms of reproductive therapy that involve the implantation of several fertilized eggs that then leave others on the outside to die. These cases ought to not, the intention ought not matter in these examples. So the fertilized egg which fails to implant has the same moral significance as the fertilized egg which comes to term, as the fertilized egg which is left in the petri dish and never implanted, and as the fertilized egg which is aborted. So that aspect of natural law arguments seems, not only at a very deeply technical level, but even in a common sense way, to not be appealing, because there is very little clamor from anyone on the left or the right in any type of theological spectrum or political spectrum to ensure that women who had sex roughly 1 week prior to menstruation ought to then be checked to make sure that everything they do in that week in between sort of allows any possible fertilized egg to implant. If there's a spontaneous failure to implant, we do not treat that with the same type of significance as a woman who then chooses to have an abortion, or even a woman who chooses to take the morning after pill. And so there's a way in which intention factors into those discussions that actually does not work very well with natural law arguments. And I am not here in this video going to make a claim one way or the other as to which is more appropriate, simply to state that there is a type of incoherence in between our emotional and at times legal and ethical responses to these sets of circumstances, and people on both sides, whether these are deontological conservatives, situation ethics progressives, whether they're a type of centrist or agnostic about the moment of conception versus the moment of ensoulment. Within those debates, there is very often a high level of inconsistency in applying one's position. And for those who are consistent in applying their position, those are often the people with whom we have the greatest struggle, because there seems to be aspects on either side of the spectrum of their positions which are gross and immoral. So that is giving, I think, Aquinas a more fair shake, because he is willing to commit thoroughly to this hylomorphic version of the self that then requires a type of Aristotelian functional ethic that is very much deontological in his thinking. It's rigorous and it has numerous problems at the same time. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what makes this issue, the issue of human sexuality and its connection to reproduction, so difficult. Now, with that said, I don't think there's any difficulty in saying that Martin Luther's words are utterly reprehensible and that he should be chastised and condemned heartily for what he said on the Jews and their lies. But what can we learn from this beyond what I'd said in the last lecture? How can we reflect on the monstrous things that he said? And I think to get at what's going on here, it's very important to read this as an ironic text. So if you read it once or you read half of it and closed the book and discussed, try reading it again. But read it with this in mind. Luther writes this towards the end of his life. He dies 2 years later and he spends his last years in ill health. However, he has also seen his desire for reform spread everywhere. On the one hand, the Counter-Reformation is underway, and while it results in significant persecution for Protestants, so for those who followed his commands to reform the church, especially in France and Spain, where the Huguenots remained a significant, like a really persecuted people for a long time. But there were at the same time reforms occurring within. There were reforms occurring in the Roman Catholic Church that attempted to correct what was seen as an actual moral corruption. There was a renewal of emphasis on the piety of religious life. You have the creation of the Jesuits and their focus on personal self-control and a devotion to the religious life. You have the work and life of Ignatius, sort of St. Ignatius of Loyola, whose spiritual practices were hugely influential going forward on developing a type of Catholic piety that is in large part what Luther saw as absent from the corrupt and decadent version of Roman Catholicism that he started his life in. So there are these great successes which he, in a large way, helped to instigate. So while he's not resting on his laurels, he very much has a sense that that sometimes the kid sneaking up really works.
I sneaked up on
One moment. Yeah, you did.
I just did it so quiet because I didn't want you to hear me.
Sorry about that. So Luther is a man who has achieved by his own standards something akin to greatness, in the sense that he has effected great change. Now, in light of my earlier mention of greatness, it's not really that good of a thing. And for all of Luther's achievements, this text is filled with a type of vitriol that is convinced, or that attempts to convince the reader, that the Jews think they are so great. And so somehow this people, which exists as a diaspora that he admits is persecuted and has been almost punished by God, is convinced of their own greatness by appealing to their bloodline. And he hammers down on how self-important and how great the Jews think they are, while he himself is, from an outsider's perspective, and most likely even from his own, convinced that he has done a great thing. Now, I want you to, as you read it in light of the parable of Jesus, wherein we encounter the prayer of the Pharisee and the tax collector. So the Pharisee prays first in the synagogue. Thank you, Lord, for making me so great, and that I am not like this tax collector, because I follow the Sabbath, because I give. And there's a way in which the Pharisee's prayer is giving thanks to God for how great he is. Meanwhile, the tax collector's prayer in quiet is, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. And for all of Luther's attempts to paint the Jews as puffing up their chests, he nevertheless highlights all of the ways in which their lives, the existence of the Jewish people, is in many ways miserable. They exist without a homeland. They exist without legal rights in many areas of Europe. And somehow he needs to make them great so that it is their pride that is being punished. And similarly, tax collectors would have had a lot of money and yet would have been seen as betrayers of their fellow Jews in Jesus' time. And what we're getting in this piece is, I think, a significant amount of transference as well as anti-Semitism, where Luther's own greatness, his own successes are being completely ignored in a sinful manner as he paints someone else or another group of people as being puffed up in order that he might tear them down. And yet we encounter none of that type of language coming from Jewish authors at this time. And I think, so when Luther's life is considered, and the legacy of the Reformation, which includes this history of anti-Semitism that is rekindled in Luther's writings, I think that his own greatness my son has decided to intervene, let's say. So I'm going to try to occlude that and intervene in this text and just sum up what I'm saying by seeing Luther as someone who himself is utterly sinful and who is portraying this greatness in others, or attempting to build a vision of an enemy that actually has the qualities which he himself possesses, and perhaps at some subconscious level realizes is a sinful thing. It is not good for him to be puffed up, and yet he is. It's very clear from his polemics that there's a type of false bravado later in his writing that is different from a real type of simple piety. The Luther who wrote of the pleasures of married life for, or in a way that refuses clerical celibacy, that early Luther that we saw at the beginning of the text is not late Luther. And so what is created then is a type of object of transference in a whole people group who are supposedly great and yet are being punished by God. Right as he himself is objectively great, and through a series of debilitating physical ailments, we could perhaps say is being punished by God. At least if we're using the logic of Luther to say that persecution or misfortune is necessarily an affliction that comes from God. There's another way to read this that says that there is actually simply brokenness and sinfulness in the world, and that it befalls all people, and that we understand that God causes the rain to fall on the just and on the unjust. The sun shines on the wicked and the good. This is a more Christological interpretation of how suffering is spread out and inevitably will befall everyone in some way or another. But instead, what we have is someone at the height of their powers who's nevertheless experiencing great physical turmoil. That person is attempting to create a boogeyman or an object of transference, which he wants to make great, and then through the ostensible greatness, demonstrate just why they are suffering, or cause to bring down through God's wrath and judgment. So that is simply my interpretation of this, using a very simple type of psychoanalysis of Luther. I am not the only person to have done this, but with that said, hopefully you can see at least the logic of what's happening, if not the rightness of it. And I certainly hope you don't see the rightness in this text, because there is none. So, with that said, thank you for paying attention till the end. And I wanted to, as I said, just give a couple brief comments for the paper if you're working on it. And the first one, this is very important. I know that if you have read the outline of how the paper should be going, that I have asked you for two types of ethical reasoning that justify a position. But to drive that home further, I simply want to say that as you begin formulating things, and some of you have asked me for questions to then build off of, you should not, in your essay, be asking a question and answering it. At least not just. What I want you to do is to make a definite statement and then reason for it in two ways. So rather than thinking of this as a question, so to give an example, should modern states allow for circumcision based on religious practice? This is a question. And if that was the question that was behind your essay, you would then get to the end of the essay and say, because of these reasons, yes. Don't do that. Please, please, please don't do that. Rather, what I am saying that you do, what I am asking that you do, and because this is part of the basic instructions of the essay, I will be severely penalizing you if you do not do this. Begin with a position. So, to reframe it, you would then say, in today's pluralistic societies, which are nevertheless secular, it is still all right for states to allow circumcision in case of religious preference. Because, A, this is my personalist argument for it, and B, this is my utilitarian argument for it. That is what's going to get you good marks for a good structure through the paper. So you are not answering the question. You are beginning with an ethical claim, and then you are offering two different types of justification for why that claim is valid. I hope you see the difference. If you have any questions or doubts about this difference, please let me know. But and I will then answer. But the simplest thing I can say is that you are not answering a question. You are making a case using two modes of reasoning. I hope we're all clear on that. With that said, I am going to open up the discussion forum online now for you to be able to talk about some of these texts. If there were some things that were particularly harmful or difficult, and you have sort of topics that you would not like mentioned, or perhaps you even want some content warnings, let me know.
Supper time.
And I will attempt to moderate discussions in a way.
Time.
It's supper time? Great, good to know. I'll be down for supper soon. With that, we have come to an end, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend and that all of your Easter activities as we proceed through Lent are going apace. Take care.
Bye.
Have a great weekend.
See you later.